Do you know how you see things that can't be explained? Out here on the Navajo reservation, it's no different. Nearly everyone knows about supernatural things here. We deal with it all the time, since the Navajos are spiritual and know of both the good and bad sides of it. My mother recalls some of the strange things that happened to her as a child, growing up in Twin Lakes. As children, my mother and her sisters were often left alone for long periods of time at the hogan where they lived. They would be visited by strange creatures, monsters, that would lurk around outside at night, banging on the walls or attempting to chase them and carry them away. One of these experiences is incredibly bizarre, as my mother remembers it in detail. One day, my mother and her younger sister, Alberta, were alone at the hogan. For those who don't know, a hogan is a circular dwelling with a stove set in the middle of the room. Who knows where everyone went? Everyone, including the remainder of her sisters, were gone. Suddenly, the dog started barking horribly and snarling at something that was outside. My mother quickly ran inside the hogan and screamed as a tall, hulky, beastly thing came through the door after her. It chased her hideously around the stove in the middle of the room. My mom recalls the thing as tall, covered in thick, black hair, and moving clumsily. She compares it to a ape creature or ape man, though who knows exactly what it was. She ducked under a bed that was against the wall and found her sister hiding back there already. As they hid under the bed, the thing grabbed Alberta's leg and tried to yank her out from under the bed. He, or it, was very strong, and she was nearly dragged away, but the two girls clung to each other and hung on for dear life as the thing tugged at her leg. When that didn't work, the beast attempted to pull the bed away from the wall, and even pulled off the mattress where they saw a clear view of him fumbling around. The two were screaming in dead fear, and my mom says there that she doesn't remember what happened for a few minutes after that, a missing piece in the puzzle. She tells about the event that followed. Things had suddenly quieted down, and my mother sat in the crevice between the door and the wall. She sat with her eyes squeezed shut, and when she opened them, she found a dark, hairy face staring at her between the slats in the boards of the door. My mother then thinks she fainted in fright. This is only one account of a strange creature sighting she had along with her sisters. To this day, she still doesn't know what or who they were or where they came from, but she thinks they were skinwalkers, or people who walk around in animal skins doing witchcraft. Many people here know of the skinwalker issue, and it's a common one to seek out help from a medicine man. The problem is, what kind of animal was that one imitating? It couldn't have been Sasquatch. Or could it? The holidays always make me think of this story that a family friend told us one year when he came to visit us during Christmas. He was a colleague of my father's and used to teach physics at Penn State. Christmas of 2004, he came down to visit us. Let me just note that he was a very practical man and definitely a skeptic to the supernatural. We lived near Columbia, Pennsylvania, and he was driving down Route 23 very early one morning. It was bitter cold, and there was fog covering most of the road. Suddenly, his headlights shone over a small figure of about 5 feet shuffling down the center of the highway. He thought it was a small child and worried about its safety at this hour. But as he neared it, he realized it wasn't a child at all. The creature was stick-thin and covered from head to toe in pale hair or long fur. When he got within a couple of yards, the creature turned and stared at him with big, yellow eyes, but he couldn't make out the face, for it was completely masked in hair. Then it drew a pale arm back and chucked what he assumed was a rock at his windshield. He slammed on his brakes and watched as the rock, which actually was an apple, hit his windshield and bounced off, leaving a smeared mark. He sat there shocked and confused, and the creature completely disappeared into the thick fog. Curiosity and a bit of anger made our friend start driving again, with every intent to find the creature and find out what it was once and for all. But he never saw it again. Once he got to our house, he looked ashen and frightened and quickly recounted his story. My cousin was there at the time and told us of strange creatures that the Native Americans that used to inhabit this area would call strange spirits, or yobongos. The yobongos were haunting spirits that were either completely naked or covered in hair, often resembling small men, and they would wield apples if one got too close to them. He told us of how one night his neighbor heard loud banging noises coming from outside. The neighbor and his wife went outside to see what it was and found dozens of smashed apples scattered outside their door, as if someone had purposely thrown them there, but nobody was around. Although, later that night, the dog started barking hysterically, and then there was an eerie scream, unlike anything they've ever heard before, come from the woods in the backyard. I've lived here all my life, and I've never seen a yobongo, but it gives me the creeps to drive down Route 23 on my own. I have nightmares about running into one, and I hope I never will. Various true paranormal things have happened to me. I'm 22 now. The first happened when I was about 7 in Springfield, Missouri. We lived in a mobile home that was given to my mother when she left my abusive father. The house was right next to the woods. I had 2 windows in my room, one on each side of the room. When I would get home from the sitters, when Mom was at work, I would go to the woods and climb the trees with the next-door neighbor. Mom would be outside, making sure we were okay. One day, I was in a tree and my friend, Bill, looked up and paled. He could not say anything, just pointed. I looked up, and there it was. It was about 5 feet tall and had big eyes and kind of looked like the Ewoks from Star Wars. Bill climbed down the tree and ran home, and I just looked onward. I wasn't scared. In fact, I scared it. I could tell because of its breathing hard, and it sounded almost as if though it was crying. Mom called me in, so I climbed down and went home. I told my mom what I saw, and she said I was lying. That night, I was in bed and saw a shadow from the window. I went over to look, and there it was, with 2 bigger ones with it. The bigger ones were about 4 feet taller than the smaller one. They were looking at me, almost as if though they were confused. I was excited because I saw them again. The bigger ones left and the little ones stayed behind and just looked at me. Then it ran off, I then went to bed again. The next day, I went outside and looked for them, but they were gone. The next couple of days I looked, and they were not there. Every so often they would come back at night, and I would be incredibly happy. They would just come and look inquisitively. Unfortunately, we moved when I was 8. Our last night there, they came by, and I just cried. They looked at me like they were confused. Then I put my head on the window, and they nodded, and I did the same. The little one looked like he was sad, too. And to this day, I do still miss them. One late afternoon in early August of 2009, I decided I wanted to go for a walk to enjoy the countryside of Vinton, Iowa. I grabbed my MP3 player, headphones, and a bottle of water. I left the house around 7:15 p.m. and made my way to 58th Street. Now, 58th Street is mostly pavement, but about halfway down it turns into gravel. I made my way down the road until the pavement ended. I made it to the end of the road just before it turned left onto another gravel road. At this point, it was nearing 8 p.m., and the sun had almost set. I figured it was getting dark, so I should call it a night. As I was walking back, I noticed a neighbor's dog barking uncontrollably at something up the road. I brushed it off as a raccoon or a possum. As I walked further, I noticed a foul odor in the air. It smelled like a cross between a wet dog, a skunk, and rotten eggs. I neared a trailer off to my right, with a lamppost directly beside it. The light was a good 100 feet from the street, so it made a very dim light as I passed. I remember the smell getting stronger and stronger as I kept walking. I stopped in front of the dim light so I could change the song on my music player. In my peripheral vision, I noticed movement in the ditch. At the time, I assumed it was just a tree. But then I noticed that this tree stood up. I snapped my head to the right, and what I saw, I will never forget. It had to have been at least 10 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown hair. It had an oval head that connected directly to very broad shoulders. It was facing away from me, so I didn't see its mug. The creature seemed like it didn't even notice my presence. After a few seconds of staring at this thing, it walked out of the ditch on 2 legs and into the field. It made its way to the tree line of the surrounding wooded area and let out a blood-curdling scream. I ran home as fast as my feet would carry me. I lived with my mother at the time. As soon as I walked through the door, my mom asked me what had happened. She said that I looked like I had seen a ghost. I told her what I saw, and she said my mind was playing tricks on me. I know that what I saw and what I heard was real. I went to bed that night and tried to forget about what had just happened. The next day, I went to the grocery store in town to pick up a few things. I overheard some of our neighbors talking about a couple down the street that had 2 baby cattle go missing last night. They were almost talking about how the branches on the trees leading up to the cattle were all snapped in half, and 3 of their sapling trees were torn from the ground. I've always been very skeptical about paranormal things, but I still think, to this day, that what I saw was a Sasquatch. This story was documented by my sister. who had this experience sometime around 1993 or so. Here is what she had to say about her paranormal experience. My Bigfoot experience happened when I was about 12 years old. I was at a church youth group retreat in Geneva Hills, a large campground in southeast Ohio. As dusk approached, the group decided to play Kick the Can. Geneva Hills comprises miles and miles of thick woods, rolling hills, and streams and creeks, typical southeast Ohio. So we were playing Kick the Can, and I decided to hide just inside the edge of the woods behind a large tree. By this time, it had gotten darker, and my eyes were beginning to adjust to the decrease in light. Facing the woods, there was a small creek directly in front of me with a rather steep bank. The bank was probably about 15 to 20 feet high on each side. I was crouching behind the tree, still facing the woods, waiting to make my move on the can, when I suddenly heard something nearby. I looked to the right, toward the sound, and saw two large figures about 30 yards away. I remember I kept blinking and straining my eyes to see the figures, wondering if what I was seeing was real. I watched these figures make their way down the opposite side of the creek bank toward the water. I could smell a musty, animal scent, and watched as the creatures drank the water using their hands like a cup. They were fairly quiet. They moved easily through the woods, and they didn't make any vocal noises that I could hear. I was incredibly frightened and was afraid to move or make a sound. I remember thinking they had a sense of my presence. They were so close that there's no way they couldn't have. They had to be at least 6 feet tall, with dark-colored, brownish-black, I'd say, thick coat of fur. I don't remember how long they were at the water's edge drinking, but it was likely only a few minutes. They then made their way back up the bank and into the woods. As I felt they were far enough away that they wouldn't hear me, I bolted out of the woods towards the cabin. My sister found me and immediately knew something had happened. She said I looked pale and scared, and I remember telling her a little bit about what I saw. I made her promise not to tell anyone else in our church group about it, because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. It's even hard for me to talk about it now, because I still feel like people will think I'm crazy, or will say I was just seeing things. It was the most frightening feeling I've ever felt up to that point in my life. It's always been difficult to recount frightening memories like this. It's almost painful. But I know what I saw, and I am certain that it was Bigfoot. Back in the late 1970s, my parents purchased an old farmhouse that was built in 1880 in a town called South Courtright, New York. The house sat on 7 acres of a beautiful valley in the middle of the Adirondack Mountains. The farmhouse was in disrepair when they purchased it, but over the years, they fixed it up into a very comfortable weekend and summer retreat from the urban bustle of the New York City area where we lived. The trip took 3.5 to 4 hours every Friday night, but my sister and I didn't mind it at all. One night, after we arrived at approximately 9 at night, my sister and I sat at the kitchen table, eating sandwiches for dinner while my parents had cocktails in the front living room. The kitchen was at the rear of the house, and the windows faced a drop-off in the property which ran down to a clear running stream. As I was eating my dinner, I was gazing out the window. It was a dark, overcast and moonless October night. As I turned my head from facing my sister, I looked out the window, which was 12 feet from where I was sitting. And there, illuminated from the light spilling out of the kitchen, was a huge, ape-like face staring back at me. It had a broad, wide face with no discernible neck and shoulders that spread out beyond the 4-foot-wide window. The brow of the creature was heavy, and I don't recall any expression on the creature's face. It was clearly and most obviously a Sasquatch. But what was different from any description that I had heard before about a Bigfoot was that the hair of this creature was more orange-like and not brown or black. At this point I yelled and motioned to the window, and my sister turned and saw the creature as well. We both yelled for my parents, but when they got there, the creature was gone. My father and I took flashlights and went outside to look for it, but the ground was too hard due to a cold autumn that year. What we did realize, however, was that the creature would have been over 9 feet tall for its face to be visible through the window at the kitchen, since the basement level was exposed at that part of the house, as the farmhouse was built into a hill. My parents never believed my sister and I, especially since the color of the beast was orange. But about 2 weeks later, we read a local paper in which a farmer said he spotted a big hairy creature breaking into his henhouse and stealing chickens. The color of the creature's hair, orange. (1967) The Betty Andreasson abduction. Just the thought of alien abduction makes most of us turn away in confusion and disbelief. However, we must confront this issue, as it is an integral part of the UFO mystery. Though abduction itself may seem unlikely, some abductions fall into the truly bizarre category. One of these cases is the abduction of Betty Andreasson that occurred on the night of January 25th, 1967, in the town of South Ashburnham, Massachusetts. This riveting case has become a mainstay of UFO literature. Betty was in her kitchen around 6:30 p.m. on the night of her abduction. The rest of her family, 7 children, her mother, and father were in the living room. The lights in the house began to blink, and a red light beamed into the house through the kitchen window. Betty's children were on edge after the lights blinked, and she ran to quiet them. Startled by the red beam, Betty's father ran to look out of the kitchen window to see where the light was coming from. He was amazed to see 5 strange creatures heading up toward their house in a hopping motion. He was startled to see the creatures simply walk through the wooden door of the kitchen right into the house. In a moment, the entire family was put into a type of trance. Betty's father would be attended by one of the creatures, while another began to have telepathic conversations with Betty. She and her father both thought that one of the creatures was the leader. He was about 5 feet tall. The other 4 were approximately a foot shorter. They had very wide eyes, small ears and noses, set in a pear-shaped head. There were only slits where their mouths should have been. They only communicated with their minds. The 5 creatures wore a blue coverall with a wide belt. On their sleeves could be seen a logo of a bird. 3 fingers were on their hands, and their feet were shod with boots. They did not actually walk, but floated as they moved along. Betty later would recall that she was not frightened by their presence, but instead felt calm. Meanwhile, Betty's mother and children were still in a state of suspended animation. When Betty seemed worried about them, the aliens released her 11-year-old daughter from the trance to assure her that no harm was being done to her family. Soon, Betty was taken by the aliens to a waiting craft, which rested on a hill outside of her home. Betty estimated the craft to be about 20 feet in diameter and saucer-shaped. Betty recalls that after she was aboard the UFO outside of her house, the craft took off and joined a mothership. There, she was subjected to a physical examination and the victim of tests by strange equipment. She was given one test which caused her pain, but resulted in being a religious awakening. She estimates that she was gone for 4 hours before being brought home by 2 of the aliens. Returning home, she ran to see the rest of her family. They were yet in some kind of suspended state. All along, one of the aliens had waited behind with her family. Finally, they were released from the bonds of the trance, and the aliens left. Betty had been hypnotized and told not to reveal any details of her experience. Though some of the details of her abduction were temporarily lost to her, some things she would be able to recall. She remembered the power outage, the red beam of light coming into the house, and the aliens coming. Some 8 years after her experience, she answered an ad from researcher Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He was soliciting for anyone who may have had an alien experience. The letter she sent to Hynek was rejected, however, being too bizarre to be believed. 2 more years would transpire before her story would be investigated. The group of investigators included an electronics engineer, an aerospace engineer, a telecommunications specialist, a solar physicist, and a UFO investigator. Betty's case of alien abduction was very strange. Yet a very good case for investigation, containing much more information than the average case. 12 months of in-depth study went into the case. Betty was involved in character analysis, polygraph examinations, psychiatric review, and 14 sessions of regressive hypnosis. The results? Betty, along with her daughter, agreed in all basic details of the case. The results of this analysis were presented in a 528-page review. The review basically stated that Betty and her daughter were sane individuals, believing in their experience as presented. The Betty Andreasen Luca abduction is a case which still is discussed today by UFO investigators. 1967. The Herbert Schirmer abduction. 22-year-old policeman Herbert Schirmer would have a bizarre experience on December 3rd, 1967. While making his normal patrol rounds in Ashland, Nebraska, he saw what appeared to be red lights atop a large truck. He had checked locations along Highway 6 and just hit the intersection of 2 highways, 6 and 63, when he saw the red lights. He would get a closer look. As he continued down Highway 63, he came to a stop and shined his headlights on the red-lighted object. He immediately knew the object was no truck. The red beaming lights were coming through what Schirmer described as portholes. He could clearly see a disc-shaped, metallic UFO that was hovering about 8 feet off the ground. The polished, aluminum object had a type of walkway around its circumference. He could also see what he thought were legs below the object. the UFO began to send flames below it as it rose into the air. Schirmer could hear a siren sound coming from the object as it rose higher and higher. The UFO then passed directly over his police car, then flew out of sight. Schirmer sped back to the police station, making a note of the time as 3 a.m. This shocked him because he knew he had been on patrol much longer than 10 minutes the present time indicated. Schirmer made the following entry into his log. Saw a flying saucer at the junction of Highways 6 and 63. Believe it or not. Schirmer began to experience some physical problems right after his sighting. He suffered from headaches, felt ill, and had a red welt on his neck. The Condon Commission, located at the University of Colorado, and at the time investigating UFO sightings, heard of Schirmer's sighting and requested that he come to Boulder, Colorado. On February 13, 1968, Schirmer would undergo regressive hypnosis administered by psychologist Dr. Leo Sprinkle of the University of Wyoming. The regression sessions would bring about many new details that Schirmer had suppressed. As he neared the UFO, the engine in his police patroller failed, and his radio went dead. Some type of white object emerged from the UFO and communicated with him telepathically. This object kept Schirmer from drawing his firearm. Other facts recalled by the patrolman were that the beings from the ship were friendly. They powered their UFO through the electric lines and had a base of operation on the planet Venus. The Condon Committee concluded that evaluation of psychological assessment tests, the lack of any evidence, and interviews with the patrolman left project staff with no confidence that the troopers' reported UFO experience was physically real. Psychologist Dr. Sprinkle, however, felt that Schirmer believed in the reality of the events he described. When Schirmer returned to his duties in Ashland, Police Chief Woloskin resigned, and Schirmer was appointed as new chief. But because of ridicule from the citizens and the UFO experience, he was not able to rightfully perform his duties and resigned 2 months later. Someone had thrown dynamite into his patrol car, and his wife left him during this time. Looking for relief from his psychological problems, he would undergo more regressive hypnosis in June of 1968. Hypnotist Loring G. Williams conducted the sessions, which would reveal many more details of his encounter with the UFO. There would be 2 books written about his experiences: Gods, Demons, and Space Chariots, and Gods and Devils from Outer Space by Eric Norman. It is very difficult to ascertain whether or not Schirmer's experience was real or imaginary. 1968. The Buff Ledge Alien Abductions. A valid account of the alien abduction of 2 teenage counselors comes to us from the state of Vermont. 4 UFOs would appear in daylight over the lake of Buff Ledge Camp, making baffling maneuvers with the lightness of a falling leaf. On August 7, 1968, the strange encounter began for 16-year-old Michael Lapp, maintenance man for the camp, and 19-year-old Janet Cornell, water ski instructor. The camp was located north of Burlington on Lake Champlain. The 2 were taking a break on a boat dock. On a warm afternoon, the camp was sparsely inhabited because the swimming team had gone to Burlington for a meet. In the later part of the afternoon, Michael and Janet were simply enjoying the view of the setting sun, when suddenly a bright light appeared. Was this light an extraordinary view of Venus, or something else? Their question would soon be answered as the source of light began to drop down toward the 2 friends. As the object grew closer, the shape became more clear, as it was saucer-shaped. Suddenly, Michael remarked, "Wow, Venus is falling." But he knew better. The lone light now dropped 3 smaller lights from it, and they immediately soared over the lake. The larger objects soon disappeared from sight. It was obvious the objects were being intelligently controlled. The UFOs seemed to perform for the 2 mesmerized teenagers, doing zigzags, loops, and then would suddenly drop like a falling leaf. Now, the 3 UFOs moved even closer to the 2 friends. The UFOs formed a triangle formation, and then 2 of them pulled away, leaving just 1 out front. Later, Michael would recall hearing something that sounded like 1,000 tuning forks as the 2 objects pulled back. The last UFO then passed right over them, shot upward, and briefly disappeared. Soon it would reappear, tilted to one side, then drop straight into the lake. After a time, it would emerge from the lake and then begin moving directly toward Michael and Janet. The UFO was so close now, the 2 beings could be seen through the transparent cupola of the object. The beings appeared childlike. According to Michael, their necks were elongated. They had big heads for their body size. They had no hair, but large eyes which wrapped around the side of their heads. He thought that he was in mental contact with the beings. For some odd reason, as Michael watched the aliens, he slapped his knee. One alien did likewise. The UFO was now directly over their heads as it shot a beam at the 2. Michael grabbed Janet's shoulders and pulled back, landing both of them on the deck on their backs. He then was terrified of being taken and screamed, "We don't want to go!" The next thing Michael recalled was sitting on the deck and gazing at the object, which was now farther away from them. Janet seemed to just sit in a trance. It was now totally dark. Soon, they heard members of the swim team talking as they made their way back into the camp. The UFO moved higher up into the sky. It flashed its lights a number of times and then disappeared. Michael wondered, how long have we been here? Nothing would be said about what happened that late afternoon. When summer camp ended, the 2 went their separate ways. Michael rarely thought about his experience for the next 5 years, but as time went on, he began to have disturbing dreams. 10 years after Michael's experience, he decided to contact the Center for UFO Studies. He was referred to investigator Walter Webb. After becoming familiar with the details of the case, Webb suggested regressive hypnosis to relieve Michael's nightmares and hopefully regain his lost memories. The sessions brought back the events of the late afternoon experience at Buff Ledge. But now, he recalled being lifted by a beam into the waiting UFO and going into a larger UFO. He also remembered Janet lying on an examination table. The being shone a light into her eyes, took skin samples and fluids from her body. The aliens all looked alike, Michael recalled, and had those large eyes, a mouth without lips, no ears, and 2 small openings for a nose. Michael also described the beings as having 3 pointed, web-like digits for fingers, and their bodies felt damp and clammy. Michael recalls the aliens wanted life on our planet to be like theirs, without violence. Janet, now 29, would also be regressed. Her recalled memories would only strengthen the case of alien abduction. She recalled the coldness of the table, something had pulled her hair and pinched her neck. There was no disharmony in Michael and Janet's statements. Webb also conducted an investigation outside the boundaries of regressive hypnosis. He was able to find other members of Buff Ledge that had witnessed strange lights over Lake Champlain on the same night as Michael and Janet's abduction. 2 other members of the camp also claimed to have been abducted after seeing strange lights, but earlier in the summer. Their names were not released, and the events at Buff Ledge Camp are certainly proof of an alien abduction. 1973. The Pascagoula, Mississippi alien abductions. On the night of October 10th, 1973, there was a UFO sighting by 15 different witnesses who saw a strange, unknown object fly over a housing project in St. Tammany Parish, New Orleans, Louisiana. 2 of the witnesses were policemen. The sighting would only be the beginning of what was to occur the next night on the nearby Pascagoula River. 2 fishermen, 19-year-old Calvin Parker and 42-year-old Charles Hickson, were about to have an experience that would forever change their lives. Parker and Hickson were continual fishing buddies. They were both living in the town of Gautier, Mississippi. On one particular night, they were fishing the waters of the Pascagoula River when they heard a strange sound, a type of buzzing. The 2 men immediately turned to see what was the source of the strange noise. They were shocked to see an egg-shaped object with bluish front lighting. The object was only a few feet above the water and about 10 yards from the 2 frightened fishermen. While they sat stunned, looking at the weird flying machine, a door opened in the UFO, and to their utter amazement, 3 beings of unknown origin began to float toward the 2. The beings did have legs, but they did not use them. They literally floated across the water toward Hickson and Parker. The 2 fishermen would later attempt to describe what the beings looked like. About 5 feet tall, had bullet-shaped heads without necks, slits for mouths, and where their noses or ears would be, they had thin, conical objects sticking out like carrots from a snowman's head. Hickson sat frozen on the riverbank. Suddenly, 2 of the odd-looking beings grabbed him, while the 3rd being snatched Parker, who immediately fainted from fear. The beings supported Hickson by literally holding up his body. As they did, he felt numbness over his entire body. By some power he could not see, he was floated into the bows of the waiting object to a brightly lit room. The room had no gravity. He floated with a strange eye-like device. The device would go over his entire body as if it was scanning him. After the eye-like device was finished with Hickson, he was left floating in the room alone. The beings had probably left to examine Parker. Approximately 20 minutes after the ordeal had begun, it was over. Hickson was now floated back out of the craft. Back on the riverbank, he could see Parker, who was crying and praying on the ground. Shortly, the strange flying object rose straight into the night sky and flew away. After some time to regain their senses and strength, they began to talk about what action they should take. At first, they were afraid to report their experience, but they felt obligated to tell someone. What if these beings were taking other people in the area? Fighting fears of public ridicule, they called Kessler Air Force Base in Biloxi. They were instructed to report their incident to the local sheriff's department. Not wanting to deal with local law enforcement, they decided instead to go to their local newspaper office. The office was closed, which left the men only one recourse: the sheriff's office. As would be expected, the local sheriff thought their story was a hoax or trick. Trying to get to the bottom of their story, the two fishermen were placed in a room wired for sound. It was thought that they would discuss the joke between themselves, and their story would be found out. This was not to be. Soon law enforcement personnel knew that something had certainly frightened Hickson and Parker, and that this was no joke. It would be no time until details of the alleged abduction began to leak out to the public. First, the account of the incident was published in local newspapers, soon followed by the wire services. In a matter of a couple of days, the Pascagoula, Mississippi abduction was a big news item over the entire United States. Aerial Phenomena Research Organization sent University of California professor James Harder to investigate the story. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who represented the U.S. Air Force, also would research the case. Harder and Hynek did a lot of the investigative work together. The two well-known researchers first interviewed the two fishermen together. Harder tried to do regressive hypnosis on Hickson, but the abductee was so frightened that the hypnosis was stopped. To get things off on solid ground, both of the witnesses took polygraph tests, and both passed without a problem. Harder and Hynek both believed that the two tormented men were telling the truth. Esteemed UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek would proclaim that there was definitely something here that was not terrestrial. Even after 30+ years, both Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson still testify to the same story, and have never wavered in their account of what happened that October night on the Pascagoula River. There have been many articles, magazine reports, and television documentaries done on the case, and the two men gave numerous interviews about their experience. Their account, although bizarre, is one of the best researched and documented alien abduction cases in UF history. 1975. Abduction of Sergeant Moody. On August 13th, 1975, Air Force Sergeant Charles L. Moody was in the desert of Alamogordo, New Mexico, observing a meteor shower. It was 1:15 a.m. when he saw a glowing, metallic saucer-shaped object lowering to the ground approximately 300 feet away. Moody estimated the object's length at about 50 feet and its diameter at 18 to 20 feet. The UFO began to wobble as it descended. Moody was extremely frightened as the object began to move towards him. Moody tried to run from the object, but when he tried to start his car, the engine would not respond. He could now hear a high-pitched sound as the object came to a stop in mid-air about 70 feet away from him. He could make out a window in the UFO and see shadows of a human-like form. The high-pitched sound came to a stop, and as it did, he could feel his body going numb. His last conscious memory would be of the UFO rising back up into the sky and finally flying away. As the UFO left, Moody was now able to start his car. Still trembling with fear, he sped away from the desert, finally arriving home. As he entered his house, he was shocked to see that it was now 3 a.m. Somehow, he was missing about 1.5 hours. The next day, he began to have physical problems, starting with severe pain in his lower back. a rash would break out all over his body in the next few days. Taking his problems to a physician, he was told to try a type of self-hypnosis to recover the lost 1.5 hours. It seems that the self-hypnosis was working. Within a couple of weeks, Moody began to recall bits and pieces of his desert encounter, and felt that he had a fairly good account of what had happened to him. He now believed that after his body became numb, he had seen 2 beings coming towards him. The creatures were about 6 feet tall and wearing skin-tight black clothing. He had tried to fight them off, but was overcome with the numbness and went unconscious. He remembered waking inside of the craft on a table. He could not move his arms or his legs, as an alien creature stood by him. This alien was much shorter than his 2 abductors. He also wore a silvery suit instead of black. He had no hair on his head like the other 2 creatures. His brow protruded outward, and he had round eyes, small ears and nose, and his lips were extremely thin. This leader, as Moody saw him, began to communicate telepathically. Moody was asked if he would stop fighting his abduction and cooperate. With Moody's compliance, the alien used a rod-like device on his back, which stopped the paralysis. Soon, Moody was transported to a different part of the UFO, where he was shown the alien drive unit. This drive had a long rod and 3 holes in it which were covered by glass. There was a crystal-like object with a rod on both ends. During his short tour of the alien ship, Moody was told that there was a larger mothership which was waiting above the Earth. The alien leader also told him that no future contact with Earthlings would be made for 20 years. Also, Moody's memory would be lost to him for several weeks after he was released. The alien then rendered him unconscious once again. It's very difficult to make an assessment of the validity of Moody's claims. Investigator Jim Lorenzen took exception to some of his claims. In 2 separate accounts, Moody gave the distance of the mothership from Earth as 2 different amounts, and he also claimed the aliens were robust 6-foot-tall creatures, but also called them frail. On the other hand, Moody was examined by Charles McQuiston, inventor of the psychological stress evaluator, which allegedly proves if a person is telling the truth. McQuiston determined that Moody was indeed being truthful about his encounter. In 1991, Glenn was a university student in Nova Scotia. What began as an ordinary bus trip back to his hometown to visit his parents turned into a confusing distortion of time and space. I sat at the back of a school bus and there was nobody around me, says Glenn. But there was a family sitting behind the driver in the front. The bus ride was uneventful until we came close to my parents' hometown. I was looking out the window and looked at the Michelin tire factory as we went by it going uphill. When the bus reached the top of the hill, I got a strange feeling, and for some unknown reason, I started to imagine many people on the bus laughing at me. Right then and there was a blip in reality, and the bus was suddenly about a mile back on the highway. I then had the experience of watching the bus drive by the tire factory again. This kind of scared me, and I noticed that the family sitting in the front, who were talking loudly before, were now dead quiet. I approached the bus driver when we stopped and told him what I thought happened. He looked really nervous, and he said something like, "Things like that happen. Number 2. A brief leap in time. The bus driver was right, apparently. Things like that do happen. Just ask Sue, who in the autumn of 1994 was driving with her boyfriend Jim to their home in Fallbrook, California, where they might have narrowly escaped a larger rift in time. There are 2 roads in Fallbrook, says Sue, from the north and from the south. We approach from the south heading north on Mission Road, which is a 4-mile, curvy 2-lane road. It was a Friday evening, and I blurted out how weird it was that we hadn't passed any cars in the opposite direction since our turn onto Mission Road. Fallbrook is a small town, but this was a very well-traveled road. I knew it was 6:24 because I had just looked at the big amber display on the stereo when all of a sudden the car died. The pedal went hard and the lights went off. I remember feeling confused, thinking that we ran out of gas, yet knowing that we had plenty of fuel. I coasted off to a dirt turnout immediately ahead. Jim asked what happened, and I had no answer, but I felt like I had just dozed off or had gone through Jello or I don't know what. I put it in gear. Jim jumped out, came around to my side and opened the door. I jumped into the passenger seat. He got in, cranked it over, and vroom, off we went. As we pulled away, I felt irritated, a little nervous, but sure something really weird had just happened. Then I glanced at the clock on the stereo again. It was 6:36 p.m. 12 minutes had passed when, being generous, the whole incident couldn't have taken more than 90 seconds max. Number 3. He got there before he arrived. We are used to time progressing in a linear fashion, one event leading to another. Strangely, it doesn't always work like that. Consider the experience of Eula White in rural Alabama when she was a young girl in the 1920s. In those days, Eula says, rural Alabama was still kind of backward. Little electricity, and horses and wagons the only transportation for many farm folk. I remember it was a bright summer day. Early that morning, the other women and I had gathered on the front porch of the Hawkins farmhouse to shell quite a few bushels of peas and beans. About mid-afternoon, we were still on the porch shelling peas. We looked up and saw Mr. Hawkins approaching the house. Thrown across the saddle in front of him was a large white cloth sack of flour, and cradled in his left arm was a brown bag of other groceries. We watched as he rode up to the gate, and he stopped there, waiting for someone to open it. One of the boys ran to the gate and opened it. Then, in full view of all of us women and children, Mr. Hawkins vanished. He just disappeared, instantly. We sat there for a second or so, just astonished. Then, terrified, we began screaming. After a few minutes, we calmed down, but were still shaking and confused. We just didn't know what to do. So after a while, we went back to shelling peas. Mrs. Hawkins made one of the boys close the gate. About a half hour later, we looked up and again saw Mr. Hawkins riding toward the house with that same white sack of flour across the saddle in front of him and that same brown bag of groceries in his left hand. Again, he rode up to the gate without a sound and stopped. None of us had the nerve to open the gate. We were all just too afraid to move. We just sat there, staring at him, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, to our relief, Mr. Hawkins spoke. "Well, is someone going to open this gate for me?" Mr. Hawkins got there before he arrived. Number 4. Instant replay. A similar replay of time happened to Ryan Bratton at the age of 8. It was an otherwise ordinary day for him and his friend as they were sitting in his yard while other kids rode their bikes up and down a driveway. A car came down the road and stopped at a house, Ryan remembers. A kid got out and ran inside, making noises that kids around his age make. Then a girl rode her bike down the driveway. A couple of minutes after this happened, the same car went down the road and stopped at the house, and the same kid got out of the car and ran inside screaming the exact things he had been saying. Then the girl went down the hill on her bike again. I looked over to my friend, and he said he had no idea what had just happened. Number 5. Journey to the past. The most amazing experiences of slips in time, perhaps, are those in which people actually see, hear, and even interact with other people and things that seem to have been in another space and time. John was a 6-year-old in Stoke-on-Trent, England, when his brush with the past occurred. He was on his way to school with his friend when they stopped to watch some builders working on some new houses. As they approached the site, they noticed an odd cottage nearby. An old lady came out and offered John and his friends some lemonade, and they went into her house. After leaving the cottage, they continued on to school, only to discover that it was almost 4 o'clock and school was just closing. They had left home at 1:30 p.m. on a journey that should have taken about 20 minutes. The next day, John and his friend took the same route to school, but to their amazement, there was no sign of any cottage or the old lady they had seen the previous day. The only explanation seems to be that John and his friend experienced some sort of time slip, in which for a few hours they were transported back to an earlier time, when indeed a cottage and its occupant did exist on that land. Number 7. Into a future city. As strange as it was, it may be easier to understand John's experience was something that has already taken place than it is to comprehend Daisy's encounter with a place that doesn't yet exist, and may not for centuries. Daisy and her friend Rick were driving to another friend's house in September of 2004 in Rick's beat-up old truck. Suddenly, the truck's engine died, and Rick and I were stranded on a deserted highway in the middle of the night, Daisy says. We were surrounded on both sides of the road by cornfields that stretched into the distance. Rick began a desperate effort to restart the truck, but nothing seemed to work. We decided to walk to the nearest town about 2 miles away to find a payphone to call our friend. We walked for what seemed like hours, and the town was nowhere in sight. However, just when desperation was about to grip us, We saw a light, a gloriously bright light, shining over the steep hill ahead of us. We ran up the hill that blocked us from the light, and we were flabbergasted by what we saw. Just over the hill, Rick and I saw what could only be described as a futuristic city with lights streaming out of every window of the massive metallic towers. In the middle of the futuristic city was a huge silver dome. I stared at the city, stunned, until Rick elbowed me, which pulled me out of my trance, and he pointed to the sky. Hovering above the city were hundreds of hovercraft. One flew towards us with amazing speed. Rick and I were so scared that we took off running back to the broken-down truck. I never looked back, but I felt someone watching me the whole way. When we got back to the truck, it started without difficulty. Rick and I took off as fast as we could in the opposite direction, and we never went back or spoke of it again to this day. Number 1. Men in Black encounter in Indiana. The mysterious men in black have been part of UFO lore since the beginnings of ufology since the early 1940s. I work as a night security officer at a warehouse in Plainfield, Indiana. The building is located about a mile west of the Indianapolis International Airport on Reeves Road. At the time of the incident, I was working with another security officer. Over the past year or so, I and others have noticed many strange lights in the sky at night. Actually, some of these lights were distinctive V-shaped, but most were circular. On the night of February 1st, around 10:30 p.m., there was an array of bright red lights traveling over the airport heading west over Plainfield. I tried to get photos, but the light pollution from the airport and Business Parkway was too heavy. I counted 34 red lights traveling back to back and moving very slowly but in a straight line. The other security officer witnessed the same lights. I reported what I saw to a friend in Cincinnati who was interested in UFOs. He said that he would file a report with the UFO group. This was the next day, February 2nd. He told me that he received a similar report from another witness in Indianapolis. On February 8th, early Sunday morning at 1:15 a.m. or so, the security guard at the gate called me on his radio. He said that someone wanted to talk to me. This was very unusual because people rarely drive up to the gate that late, and no one has ever asked for me. I was in the back lot, so it took me a while to reach the front, even by vehicle. While making my way to the gatehouse, the security guard called me again. He sounded frantic and asked me to hurry. When I reached the gatehouse, there was a black Chevrolet Impala parked at the gate and two people standing by the gatehouse door. I parked my truck and walked over to the gatehouse. The first thing I noticed was how tall these individuals were, and that they were dressed the same. They both wore black attire, which were slacks, heavy bomber jackets, and leather gloves. They also had beret-like hats with sunglasses, even though it was dark. There was no insignia or lettering on the vehicle, though it had Ohio license plates. One of the men asked me if I had witnessed anything unusual in the sky above the airport, I mentioned what we had seen on February 1st, and that there had been a lot of different lights seen the past year or so. He says he wasn't interested in the other sightings, just what was seen over the airport. Then he wanted to know if I told anyone else. By that time, I was a bit perturbed and asked who they were. They both smiled. Then the guy apologized for taking up my time. They got back into their car and backed out. It kind of freaked me out because I have no idea who these guys were. I have heard some stories about men in black from my friend, but these guys look normal, other than their weird garb. A few nights ago, I swear I saw the same vehicle in my neighborhood in Indianapolis. It was parked down the street from my house, then pulled off as I passed it on my way to work. At this point, I don't know what to think. I'm not scared, but curious as to what they think I witnessed. Incidentally, the other security guard who witnessed the lights did not receive a visit from these guys. My report must have sparked something, though I don't think my friend used my name or specific location. I wonder if these were MIB, and why they showed so much interest in my sighting. Number 2. Friends have close encounter with tall aliens in Arizona. Tonopah, Arizona, July 1st, 2009. The following report concerns alien contact and possible MIB encounter. It was submitted to NUFORC, NUFORC, and occurred near Tonopah, Arizona on July 1st, 2009 at approximately 10:30 p.m. The area is in western Maricopa County, Arizona, approximately 50 miles west of downtown Phoenix off Interstate 10. The community of Tonopah is near the Palo Verde Nuclear Generating Station, the largest nuclear power plant in the country. While in the desert near the Palo Verde nuclear plant, the main witness and some friends saw a very large triangle-shaped UFO. They were driving down a dirt road and saw a bright flashing light. They had seen objects in the area before, and their intentions were to look for UFOs. They went off the road behind some mountains, and no sooner had they come around the mountain, they saw the large flashing light. All of them were scared, but at the same time, curious. The main witness' girlfriend was crying and telling them to turn around. They got within 200 to 300 yards from the light. It was the size of 3 football fields, triangular in shape, and had windows around it. It was about 3 stories tall and about 30 feet off the ground. They flashed their lights and it flashed back in the same sequence of flashes. The main witness and his friend, James, got out of the car and walked closer. The closer they got, the better they could make out what was standing in the windows. They could see small, big-headed aliens, and then 7 to 9 foot tall aliens. They based this on the size of the windows. Some of the windows they could see through. The other windows were dark, but then the dark windows cleared up one by one, and as they went clear, more and more aliens appeared on the windows. James was supposedly videotaping the whole time. The main witness was terrified, but excited at the same time. They walked closer and had to stop because the heat coming from the craft was so intense. The craft hovered and then landed. A large panel at the bottom of the craft opened and 2 aliens proceeded to walk out. This absolutely terrified the witnesses, but they couldn't talk or move. The main witness remembers trying to scream and run, but they couldn't move or talk. Two others were in the car honking the horn and screaming for them to come back, but they couldn't respond. The aliens walked up to within 20 feet of them. One of them was very thin and tall, about 8 to 9 feet. The other one was about 3 to 4 feet tall. The witnesses stood there in amazement, shocked because they couldn't move or speak. Then calmness came over them, and the aliens began speaking to them telepathically. They were saying not to be scared, and that they were not going to harm them. This conversation went on between the four of them for 15 to 20 minutes. They said they were here to help us, so that we would not destroy our planet, and that there was a horrible event coming soon, that it had to be stopped. One of the witnesses asked if it was something like 9/11, and they said that it was bigger and that it would come from the Middle East. The main witness then thought to himself that he had been in this situation before, and the tall alien heard his thoughts and repeated his name and said that, yes, he had been visited before when he was 6 years old in Deming, New Mexico. He had been in the desert exploring, and they had talked to him then. He had blocked that out, but it all suddenly came back. They said they knew they were coming and wanted to warn people about global warming and what was to come if they didn't start taking care of our planet. Visions of disaster then entered their heads, as if to show them what was to come. The taller alien then walked closer and held his hand. He was no longer scared. Neither was his friend, James. They said that they would see them again soon, and to warn people about saving our planet. Supposedly, James was recording the whole time. The aliens then returned to the craft, and it was gone in a split second. When the craft left, they both felt weak, but managed to make their way back to the car. When they got there, the occupants of the car, Heather and Jamie, were not crying anymore. They only hugged the witnesses. For a minute, the car would not start, and suddenly it just turned on by itself. As they started to drive away, 3 military helicopters appeared and began shining their lights on the witnesses. Then 2 military Hummers showed up and chased the witnesses. They tried to avoid the Hummers, but were told over a speaker to pull over, or they would be forced to shoot at them. They pulled over, and military personnel surrounded their vehicle. 2 men dressed in black opened the door and asked them to get out. One of them looked familiar to the main witness. He asked the witnesses to get out, and both questioned them, while the military personnel searched the car. They asked them what they had seen, how long they had been there, and if they had had any contact with the alien ship. One of the soldiers then found the video camera. The men in black reviewed it and told the witnesses they were not to speak of this. They then confiscated the camera and took the main witness with them. The other 3 witnesses asked where they were going, and they told them not to worry about it. He left with them, and they questioned him further. He kept staring at one of the men since he looked familiar. They then dropped him off on the I-10 highway near Tonopah Joe's restaurant. There he was later picked up by his friends. Number 3. 1997 Alien Abduction in Wales. A well-researched case of alien abduction comes from Wales. A well-known researcher, Margaret Fry. The case involves missing time and lost memories, a typical scenario for abduction. Multiple sightings of UFOs over the Great Orme, a legendary and mysterious mountainous region in North Wales, preceded the events of November 10th, 1997 by several days. One family would have their entire lives changed within a short period of time by encountering a strange UFO. The family was monitoring on the Bodfair Landamog Highway when, without warning, their car was overwhelmed by a purple flying object which seemed to attach itself to their car. This brief moment of terror would be followed by another in which the UFO was gone. They were again driving their car down the road, but now they were trying to understand what had happened, and they had not a clue. But they could not account for considerable hours of time lost, said Fry. The male was having trouble afterwards with a top molar tooth, and he had to go to the dentist, and a black unknown object fell out while he was at the dentist, but he had had no fillings, she had said. After the trip to the dentist's office, the husband made a report of the family's strange encounter on the highway to local authorities. Shortly thereafter, he was visited on 2 separate occasions by plain-clothed men identifying themselves as Air Force personnel. He was warned never to talk about his family's incident. The men looked like the legendary American Men in Black. The family, wanting to discuss their incident with someone, told only a friend, who in turn related their story to Margaret Fry. Fry contacted the family, but per their request, kept the names of the family members from the press. The family would get some satisfaction when another encounter on the same night was reported. A businessman from the same general area would come forward with his own story, similar to the family's. On the very same road, on the very same night, he saw a UFO which he describes as enormous, shaped like a child's spinning top and the size of a football field. He made drawings of what the craft looked like. The UFO was also reported as hovering over nearby buildings near the highway. The craft was described as being large enough to be a mothership. Number 4. 1947 Maury Island UFO Crash. In July 1947, Kenneth Arnold received a letter from Raymond Palmer. Palmer wrote Arnold that he had received a letter from a man named Fred Lee Chrisman. In the letter, Chrisman claimed that he was a harbor patrolman at Tacoma, Washington, and that he and an employee of his named Harold Dahl had seen several UFOs near Maury Island in Puget Sound. The story that Dole told was, on June 21st, 1947, Dahl, his dog, his son, and 2 crewmen were on a boat near Maury Island when suddenly 6 large metallic objects appeared silently overhead. They were donut-shaped, with a hole in the center and rows of windows around the outside. 5 of the UFOs were circling the 6th, which seemed to be having problems. Dahl beached the boat on Maury Island in order to take photos. The UFO hovered about 500 feet over them, and one of the circling UFOs moved in and touched the ailing one in the center. When it did, the center object began spitting out hot metallic material from its center hole. A lot of stuff fell on the boat, damaging it, and some fell on the dog, killing it. One piece even burned Dahl's son's arm. This regurgitation seemed to fix the ailing UFO, and all 6 objects headed off toward the ocean. Dahl picked up some of the debris and put it into the boat and then headed back to Tacoma. He took his son to the emergency room and then reported to his superior, Fredley Chrisman. Chrisman did not believe Dahl and was in fact angry about the boat being damaged. The next morning, Dahl received a visit from a man in a dark suit who told them that he had seen something he wasn't supposed to and warned him not to discuss it with anyone. Meanwhile, Chrisman had taken a boat out to the spot on Maury Island to investigate. He found tons of scattered debris about, and as he was examining the debris, he saw one of the objects appear overhead. After hearing the story and being shown a lump of the material, Arnold decided he needed some help, so he called his friend and fellow UFO witness, United Airlines Captain E.J. Smith. Smith said he would be glad to help, so Arnold flew up to Seattle and brought him back to Tacoma. The two examined the debris that Dahl and Chrisman brought them and heard the story over several times. Dahl claimed the pictures had come out spotted, as if exposed to some sort of radiation. Somehow, the two men could never seem to actually produce any of the pictures, spotted or not. The local United Press representative called and said that he was receiving anonymous phone calls from someone who apparently knew everything that Arnold and Smith were doing and saying. After seeing the debris and hearing the story, Brown and Davidson decided that it was a hoax. They took a box of the debris and told Arnold they had to leave. They drove to McCord Field and told the intelligence officer there that they felt it was a hoax. They hadn't told Arnold because they didn't want to embarrass him. The next morning, August 1st, they boarded a B-25 back to Hamilton Field. A few hours later, they were killed when the B-25 crashed. The newspapers hinted that the plane had been sabotaged because they were carrying classified material about flying saucers. They made much of the fact that the crew chief and a passenger were able to bail out, but that Brown and Davidson were not. The official explanation was that the only classified material they were carrying was a file of reports that had nothing to do with flying saucers. The plane crashed because an engine caught fire. Brown and Davidson couldn't bail out in time because a wing broke loose and tore off the tail section. Under questioning, Dahl and Chrisman later admitted that the debris was only worthless slag from a local smelter. There had been no UFOs. They had only been telling publisher Raymond Palmer what he wanted to hear. The Air Force considered prosecuting the two men, but decided they hadn't actually meant to cause any harm. Arnold packed up and flew home in disgust. On the way home, however, he crashed his plane at Pendleton because somehow the fuel valve had gotten turned off. He wasn't hurt. Chrisman and Dahl seemed to have vanished, and no one could find them. According to Jenny Randalls, two intelligence analysts who studied the case in 1980 said it had all the earmarks of an intelligence operation intended, perhaps, to discredit Arnold's original UFO sighting. Number 5. Ilkley Moore and the Men in Black. From the Nick Redfern book, The Real Men in Black, comes some valuable information on one of ufology's most mystifying cases. The case was taken under review by well-known investigator Peter Hugh. The case, as you may know, concerned police officer Philip Spencer, who while visiting the Ilkley Moor in 1987 encountered an alien being, and witnesses a UFO taking off. He was allegedly abducted, but was able to take a blurry yet compelling photograph of an alien being. This is one of only a few photographs taken of an alien considered legitimate by many researchers. Hugh's investigation uncovered the fact that Spencer suffered from missing time, a typical component of alien abduction. This fact was made known through hypnotic regression. Spencer unwillingly underwent medical testing on the UFO and was warned by alien beings of pending disaster on Earth if we did not change our ways. Spencer described the beings as being about 4 feet tall, with large eyes, huge hands, small mouth, and 3 fingers on each hand. This matched the photograph that Spencer had taken on the moor in December 1987. Just a month or so later, in January, Spencer would have a visit from the Men in Black. On a Friday evening, Spencer heard a knock on his front door. He opened it and saw 2 men of middle age. They were dressed in typical Men in Black suits. Both men showed Spencer their Ministry of Defense identification badges. Humorously, their names were Jefferson and Davis. Spencer, not knowing what to expect from the 2 visitors, invited them inside, and the 3 sat down for a talk. One of the alleged agents, Jefferson, told them that they had come to discuss an encounter the month before in the Ilkley Moor. This took Spencer by surprise, since he had only told 3 people, all civilians, about what had occurred in the moor. The 2 men were very well versed on the case and asked him a number of questions about what had happened in December 1987. Not sure how to react, and yet afraid to offend them in the case they were officially government officials, he told them about the photograph he had taken. Spencer, not wanting to have the photograph confiscated, lied to the 2 men and told them that a friend of his had the photograph. In fact, Hugh had the photograph and was having it analyzed at the time. Almost immediately, the 2 men seemed to lose interest in questioning Spencer any further. They left almost as quickly as they had arrived. It seems that the 2 Men in Black, even though they had knowledge of the Ilkley Moor events, did not realize there had been a photo taken until Spencer told them so. When they realized that the image of the alien was not immediately accessible to them, they had no more business with the eyewitness. Who exactly are the Men in Black? And who do they work for? Why do they wear clothes that make them look so old-fashioned? Why do they always drive older automobiles? Although they function as normal human men, it has been suggested by some that they are, in fact, aliens, assuming the role of humans. They have often been accused of making threats to individuals to not talk about what they have seen. This is an accusation that has also been made about U.S. government agents. Whatever the case may be, they are still a mystery today. Number 1.
One Saturday in 2008, I had the strangest encounter of my life. My cousin Anne and I were exploring the woods of Turner, Maine. My grandma always told me of the tree people she saw there as a child. I had never seen or heard them since I've lived in Maine, so I was very skeptical that they live. My iPod was stuffed in my pocket, and Anne was studying everything we passed. She believed all Grandma's stories. We came to an orange fence in the middle of the woods. The funny thing is, we own all this land. Mom and Dad would have heard about this. "Come on, let's jump over it," exclaimed Anne. She was overexcited. I sighed, but we made our way over the fence. As soon as we were over it, I felt like someone was following us. The hair on my back was standing up, and I didn't know why. I turned around to look back, but no one was there. Anne seemed fine, like she went here all the time. We were so far from that fence, my comfort zone. At one time, I was sure I saw two yellow-orange eyes, just like the color of the fence. Creepy. Suddenly, Anne yelped, "What the hell is that?" I turned and saw a skinny, slimy, brown creature staring at us. It had the same eyes that I'd seen earlier. It reminded me of a walking piece of bark. I was frozen. This thing made the hair on my head stand up. It made an awful scream that made my eardrums burst. I couldn't hear a thing for 5 minutes. The bark creature ran at such a speed that it was just a brown blur. Anne and I just stood there in shock. We made a beeline for the house. The next evening we went out again, but the orange-yellow fence was gone. The questions were ringing in my head. Had we really encountered the dwelling tree people? Where could that giant fence have gone? I knew I wasn't dreaming, because Anne remembers it too. I'll never venture that far into the woods again.
Number 2. My strange story took place on the 26th of September, 2009. My church was on retreat in Indiana, in a forest. The place we stayed at was a small building in the center of the forest. We decided that evening to go out and play in the forest with the children, so we came up with a game to play. It was like police. The kids were the police, and we would pick an adult to be the hostage. So when we began the game, we had to find the adult hiding in the forest in the middle of the night. So we started going around the back of the building, and we spotted a tall figure. It had to be at least 6 feet tall. It was running toward the trees where there was a small open area with tall grass that goes up to your knees. It ran with its arms at its sides, but it stopped at the edge of the tall grass, as if to wait for us to get closer. We chased after it, thinking it was the adult. When we were finally a few yards away, it dove into the grass and started to crawl very fast, almost snake-like. We got weirded out, but stood there staring at it. When it got across the tall grass, it began to climb a tree. It looked somewhat like a deformed cat-like animal when it was climbing. Then a few moments later, a kid yelled, "I see him!" And it was pointing in an opposite direction. We saw a similar figure running a couple of yards away, so we chased it. But then it vanished behind a tree. Turns out, a few minutes later we found the adult hiding in the parking lot in front of the building the whole time. So we have no idea what we saw that night in that forest. And I can attest, at least 15 other kids saw the same thing that I saw. And I know I'm not crazy. Number 3.
Do so-called hellhounds really exist? Where do they come from? And what would you do if you were being chased by one? It was about 4 or 5 years ago. I am 13 now. I lived in Modesto, California at the time. I moved away a year or so after this phenomenon. I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a dark and gloomy night. My mom had just told my 2 sisters and me to get the mail. The mailbox was 50 or so feet away from our 1-story house, but I didn't really mind it. My sisters and I walked to the mailbox with ease. We got the mail and started our walk back home. As we started back to our house, we heard faint growling noises. Maybe it was our stomachs, or one of our neighbor's dogs that heard our footsteps. We ignored it and kept on walking. We started hearing it louder and louder now. We all looked back, and what we saw behind us was terrifying. A pure black dog with gleaming red eyes, almost like a Rottweiler, but more demonic. We started walking faster, and that thing was right behind us. We started sprinting, and the dog did the same. It started barking at us as we ran in a full sprint in sheer terror. We got back to our house, and the porch light was on. We all turned back, and what we saw behind us was shocking. Nothing was there. The dog vanished as if it was never there. My sisters and I looked all around the street for a sign of the dog. He had vanished into thin air. I am not crazy, nor are my sisters. It was not a dream. I remember it vividly like it was yesterday. We all ran into the house panting. We told our mom about our encounter with this dog. She, of course, did not believe us. We never saw that thing ever again.
Number 4. 2 years ago, in Janesville, Minnesota, in November during first deer season, I went out and sat in a tree stand in the early morning with my shotgun. I had heard growling and large footsteps. I thought it was a large coyote, but then it came out into the clearing, and it was 5 feet tall at the shoulder and dark brown, almost black like a large dog, only its front paws were almost hands, and its tail was long like a cat's tail, 3 feet long. As it growled, I could see its teeth. They were almost the size of my small shotgun shells, 2.5 inches. I watched it come my way, and I realized that it was following my scent. I, being scared and not wanting to die, raised my gun and pushed the safety forward. When it clicked, the animal looked straight at me and started to go right towards the tree I was in. I shot 3 times. The first 2 hit a tree behind it, but the third hit it in the chest, as far as I could tell. All it did was stumble, then turn and run into thick brush nearby. I was so scared that it might be out there that I stayed in the stand for 3 hours. At noon or so, I decided to make a run to the truck. When I got to where it had been hit, I only found a little blood, like the bullet didn't go through the skin, and the blood stunk and was dark red, almost black, so I ran to my truck. Later that year, when I was trapping, I saw its tracks next to a destroyed trap set and a bunch of blood and fur of a raccoon from what I could tell. I have never gone back to those woods again. Number 5.
This event happened when I was a boy in Scottsdale, Arizona. It would have been around 1990, in the summer, July or August. I woke up to hear my mom screaming. Sleeping next to her, I woke up as well and saw her shouting and pointing at a figure across the room. Everything was dark, but the hall light was on, and the bedroom door was open, allowing some of the light in. The figure crouched on all fours on top of a dresser and was looking at her. When it saw me looking at it, it turned its head and looked right at me. It then jumped off the dresser and seemed to run out the open door, but it moved in a blur and was far too fast for a person. It dissolved when it hit the light. There was a feeling of great terror when it saw me. My mom and I talk about the incident occasionally, but she rarely discusses it since she is very religious. I am not, and thinks it had something to do with something evil. I've seen things similar to this since then, into my adult life, always preempted by feelings of being watched by some malevolent, stark-raving terror, and the urge to run and turn on the light. I saw it manifest in the daylight when I was a teenager, after waking up from a terrible nightmare. The entity struck the glass door near the couch where I slept, had its arms and legs spread before it darted away in a blur and faded like it did before. This incident isn't as credible as the previous encounter, since there were no other witnesses this time. It remains one of the most unexplained and truly horrific events of my life.
I've been a huge believer in all things paranormal for a while now. I've always loved and believed in ghost stories, poltergeist phenomena, and other things like that. Usually the only thing I'm skeptical about is cryptozoology. I don't believe in many of the weird creatures that people report seeing. All that changed during a class trip in my junior year of high school. We went up to the mountains for fresh air, scenery, and spending time bonding with our classmates. One of the required activities was a night hike. During the hike, my friend Chelsea and I spotted a path separate from the one that everyone else was taking. Together with our friend Sarah, we hung back until the group got ahead of us, then moved down the alternate trail. The trip itself was fairly normal. We had only one flashlight and made all the usual stupid Blair Witch jokes and making sounds to creep each other out. After about a half an hour, we started to get seriously freaked out. We were way deeper into the forest than we thought we were, and we were getting lost. We turned back because we started hearing the cliché rustling bushes. As soon as we headed back, we got the fright of our lives. Something huge ran across the path. Chelsea, panicking, shone her flashlight on it, and it seemed to freeze in the bright light. All I can remember is that it looked like what I'd expect a Bigfoot to look like, except its fur had some white splotches, and it had large claws. Its eyes were shining red, like most animals caught in lights. It made a noise somewhere between a scream and a howl. That split-second sight of it and the sound will stay with me for the rest of my life. I have never been more scared in my life. Just thinking of what it looked and sounded like is giving me chills as we speak. We ran back the way we came and reached camp at least an hour before everyone else, staying in the main lobby of the camp we were staying at. We asked a few of our classmates later. They said they had heard the scream, howl, but the tour guide told them it was just a mountain lion. We left the next morning without asking any of the camp employees whether they had had a run-in with the Bigfoot thing. It's been a year now, and the three of us still refuse to talk about it. I'm not a cryptozoology skeptic anymore. In the fall of 1974, I was living in Oregon, and I had decided to go backpacking on the Pacific Crest Trail south of Mount Hood. I parked my car at the trailhead and made for a small campsite at Frog Lake, some miles south, to spend the night. It was late afternoon when I got started, and as dusk approached, I was uncertain how far I was from the lake. The trail was wide, but thick forest grew on either side as the trail was cut into the mountainside. Some time passed, and suddenly I thought I heard voices and wood being broken for a fire. I stopped and identified the sounds as coming from the downslope side of the trail in the thick forest. I listened again, and it sounded like 2 or 3 people talking, but in the thick forest it was hard to make out what they were saying. So I suddenly shouted, "Hey down there! How far is it to Frog Lake?" All of a sudden there was a dead silence. A couple of minutes passed in the fading light. Then the sounds started up again. The voices were talking, but this time I listened more closely, trying to understand them. I couldn't. The voices sounded like muttering, punctuated with sibilant kind of sounds, not hissing, more like S kind of consonant sounds. It was also very fast speech, something remotely like New Guinea mountain people, if you've ever seen any National Geographic shows on that region. More unnerving, though, was the pitch of the voices. It was low. In fact, at the very lowest register of the human voice, which told me these were very large individuals. Of course, I was charged with the realization that these individuals were in fact not humans, but more likely Bigfoot people. The wood sounds came back again, but whereas I thought at first they were the sounds of wood being broken for a fire, these sounds were more like a shearing, tearing of wood. In other words, branches being stripped off a tree. Ever tried to strip even a small branch from a tree barehanded? Well, not only were sizable branches being ripped from a tree, but the sound being made traveled all the way to my ears from the depths of a dark, thick forest. These were powerful beings, and it made my blood run cold to think of how big they must have been. With all the speed I could muster while carrying a 50-pound pack, I moved my butt down the trail as fast as I could. I'd look back every few yards in the now dim light to see if a gigantic shadowy figure was headed in my direction. Fortunately, there wasn't. Soon enough I came to the lake after about a quarter of a mile and saw one lonely little campfire at the lake. I made a beeline straight for it. It turned out to be a guy from Washington State, about my age. I pitched my tent nearby after asking him if it was okay. He readily agreed and bid me to come over to the fire for some coffee. After a few pleasantries, I mentioned my prior encounter, and he just stopped in the middle of raising his cup to his lips, and with saucer eyes he said, "You heard it too?" At that moment, by that campfire, alone in the woods, long after vacationers had left the mountains, We bonded in the realization that we were nothing but a couple of Cub Scouts cut off from our troop, possibly never to be seen again. I had just moved into my new home about 2 years ago, but as I moved in, I noticed that things would go missing from a certain place and wind up in another a couple of days after it was gone. I would hear footsteps and someone running around my house. And when I would go to investigate, I would find my windows open, and once I even found a patch of black, dog-like hair stuck to a little crack in the window. So from then on, I would lock all the windows and even put locks on all my doors from the outside, so if anyone ever got into the house, they couldn't get into my rooms. After about a month and a half of peace, I thought nothing could happen again. But one night, out of nowhere, I was sleeping with my cat in the room when I heard a noise outside my window, like a scratching noise. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was one of the stray cats that wandered around sitting on my window ledge, until my cat started to hiss and her back arched. She was looking at the window. That's when I got worried. I got up and pulled my curtain back to find a very weird thing outside my window standing there. Although I only got a quick glimpse of it before I screamed and it ran away, I saw a very hairy animal with the body of a human and the face of some kind of monkey with a big wide nose and a small forehead. Since then, I have moved to another room in the house and put those burglar bars on my windows and porch so nothing can even have a chance of getting into my home without me knowing it. Another thing is that my ex-neighbor has said that she actually saw the creature in her son's nursery on a nanny camera, standing over the baby's crib, then walking to the window and climbing out around 6:58 p.m., which made her move and burn the tape after her husband saw it and didn't want news getting out about it so no one could bug them about what had happened. Let it be known that there is a Bigfoot sort of thing around the upstate New York area, and to beware. The year was 1974. The place, rural South Florida. My new bride and I found our dream house in the countryside, located right next to a great bass fishing canal. On the other side were endless acres of cattle land. One night, we heard horrible crying and screams, not human, off in the near distance. I figured maybe the cattle were mating, but it sounded more like death wails and seemed to be getting closer to the house as the night went on. These noises kept us up to the wee hours, then stopped around 5 a.m. Around 7 a.m., with my cup of coffee in hand, I stepped out onto my front porch and saw wet sand and mud imprint tracks there. Not human footprints. Being only a fisherman and not a hunter, I couldn't tell what they were. A week later, 2 police officers came to our door wanting to know if we had seen or heard anything unusual lately. They explained that several animals, cattle, had been mutilated in the field next door, and all their blood removed the same night we heard those horrible noises. I explained the prints on my patio, but I had washed them away. They asked us to remain quiet about the incident. Needless to say, our country living was never the same, and we soon sold our home. Florida skunk ape stories arose after that, but I am not a witness to any of those sightings. Only to what I heard and saw that cool, clear Florida night in '74 will I attest to as being the most scariest and heart-pounding experience of my life. It happened the morning of August 7th, 2007 at 4 a.m. I lived just outside the city limits of Kent, Washington on the East Hill. It was time to walk my 2 labs before I left for work. I own about half an acre, and behind my property is open land adjacent to a green belt that continues east for miles and miles into the open mountains. When I first stepped out into the backyard was when I heard it, loud and clear. How do I describe it in words? Kind of like Chewbacca's howl or growl in the Star Wars movies, with a wistful whine at the end. It sounded about 100 yards away, but who knows? All I know is that I was wide awake now. My dogs were just milling around, getting ready to relieve themselves, when I spotted 2 red eyes in the bushes behind my property, not more than 30 feet from where I stood. At first I thought I was seeing things, since I had just got up from sleeping. But there it still was staring at me, unblinking, which made me doubt what I was seeing. That is, until I saw it blink. The 2 of us were just staring at each other. Then it began to watch my dogs, both of which are about 90 pounds. They were relieving themselves and had not noticed the thing in the bushes, not 10 or 15 feet from them. The wind was blowing west to east, so my dogs and I were upwind from it, so that is why I presume the dogs did not notice it. The red glowing eyes were about the size of a ping pong ball and about a couple inches further apart than they should have been. It was too dark to make out any features other than its glowing eyes. For some reason, I felt no fear at all in its presence. At least nothing like the feeling I had when I heard it howl when I first stepped out of the house. I never heard anything while it was in the bushes, but it must have made some kind of noise because my male lab turned around and just began to go off barking and growling in the direction of the red glowing eyes. Both the dogs were on retractable leashes, so he didn't try to charge the thing, but my labs were agitated for sure. I saw the eyes turn to the left, and that was the last I saw of it, and not one sound did I hear as it moved away behind the bushes. There's one thing I forgot to mention, and that was that I guessed that whatever it was may have been crouched down, as the eyes were rather large, seeing as they were only about 3 feet off the ground, and when it turned to leave, the eyes were moving up and up before I lost sight of their glow at about 5 or 6 feet, as it probably was turning away. What was it? I don't know, but my guess is Bigfoot, just bored and hanging out as he made his way. Strange, but I didn't sense any aggression, not even when my dogs were challenging it. At about 5 p.m. on Monday, the 8th of October 2010, I took my girlfriend to this fire tower that overlooks the rolling hills of Hoosier National Forest. It was about a 15-minute drive down a gravel road, and you pull into this little parking lot with an extremely tall metal fire tower. Once we got there, we climbed, and after urging my hesitant girlfriend to the top, we eventually got there. It was beautiful. The sun was going down and it was warm. We took a few pictures, and as we were doing this, we heard some of the fall leaves being stepped on. We were curious to see who or what it was, because it sounded just a little ways in the woods next to us. In the parking lot, there was only one other car, and we thought maybe it was just the other people hiking or getting ready to go up the fire tower. For about another 5 minutes, we kept hearing distinct crunching of leaves, like someone walking through the woods. The only weird thing was, you can see a lot that high up, and we couldn't see what was making the noise. We started to get a little sketched out, as we were in the middle of the woods alone in rural southern Indiana. So we started to descend from the top of the tower, and as we were walking down, we could still hear leaves crunching, as if someone would take 2 steps and stop. About a quarter way down, we had a better view under the tree line, and we both stopped and listened. We looked toward where we were hearing the noise, and stayed very still and silent. As we did this, between 2 trees about 25 yards into the woods, I saw a brown mass move from what looked like behind one tree to another. I whispered to my girlfriend what I had seen. At this time, I was not scared, only overwhelmed with curiosity. We kept looking into the woods, as I had not taken my eye off the area that I had seen that brown mass move. In order to get a better view lower to the tree line, we descended a few more flights of steps. While we were doing this, we once again heard the 2-step mashing of the leaves. Anxious to get a better view, we hurried down the steps again. Again I tried to identify where I had seen that mass. Sitting in silence, I saw again movement in the forest, like something almost rocking back and forth or moving to try to hide itself. The clearest look I got was, once again, just a brown mass, but it couldn't have been a deer because a deer could not hide itself behind a tree, let alone move in the manner of this thing. After I stopped seeing the movement in the trees, my girlfriend, desperate to get a look, tried to look where I was pointing, and she also saw the movement. We then heard the 2-step mashing of the leaves a bit away from where we were looking. It was as if something else was trying to distract us. We quickly looked back to the area we had seen the creature. My girlfriend got the clearest view between the 2 of us. While hearing that leaf mashing, she saw a brown figure move behind a tree. She then, in panic, asked me if we could leave now and darted down the rest of the stairs to my car. We drove by the area on the gravel road back, but couldn't see much as it was on a bluff. I don't know what I saw, but I know I saw something I had never seen before. When talking to my girlfriend on the ride back, we both distinctly said at almost the same time, it didn't sound like it was on 4 legs, but 2, bipedal. The only bipedal creature I have ever heard that lurks in these woods goes by the name of Sasquatch. In hearing other eyewitness accounts, people always say that when you're out in the woods and you happen to see the infamous creature, they say you hear him before you see him, which is more than 100% the case with my encounter in Hoosier National Forest.